Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Brendan Cole. Two police officers were shot and seriously wounded on Thursday morning in an attack blamed on al-Shabab militiamen just kilometres from the border with Somalia. Reports on Wednesday that intelligence found on the body of Al-Qaeda's so-called African leader, Fazl Abdullah Mohammed, who died last year, provided an insight into the global aspirations of Somalia's militant al-Shabab group. But on him were documents that detail plot attacks on London. Also, earlier in the week, two Nigerian men were accused of having links with Al-Qaeda and recruiting members to train in Yemen. And the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for sanctions against al-Qaeda fighters in northern Mali who were blamed for the desecration of the tombs of Muslim saints. More than 10 years on from 9/11, the West was told how it would prevail in the fight against al-Qaeda and how Afghanistan would be the centre of that battle. But is Africa the new front? Is al-Qaeda poised to overrun states in North Africa and the Middle East? And will these countries provide safe havens from where they can launch attacks on the West? And what can the West do about it? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined on the phone by Abdul Bari Atwan. He's the editor-in-chief of the London-based newspaper Qudds Al Arabi. He's written a book about the secret history of Al-Qaeda, and he's also got a book coming out in September titled After Bin Laden, The Next Generation of Al-Qaeda. In the studio, we have Dr. Brooke Rodgers. She's a senior lecturer in risk and terror at King's College London. And in the studio is Meleagrou-Hitchens. He's a research fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation. He's just returned from East Africa, where he spoke to recruits from the Somali al-Shabab militia. I'm going to start with the news that was reported in the Toronto Star yesterday about the aspirations of al-Shabab. Meleagrou-Hitchens, what do you make of these reports that al-Shabab was planning these kinds of attacks in the UK? Does that come as some kind of surprise?
No, we can often split the Shabab interests in two, and their main interest still remains Somalia and gaining control of that region and causing instability in the surrounding region. But we also know there are pretty extensive foreign as well as Western elements in that organization. They don't always see eye to eye with each other, but there are certainly elements within al-Shabab that are very, very interested in striking Western targets, and often through the use of Westerners who have traveled to Somalia, trained, and intend to return.
Abdul Bari Atwan, I'll turn to you. Does the loss of senior advisors like Fazl Abdullah Mohammed in last year, I mean, does that have any kind of impact on al-Shabaab's operations, and what would their priority be right now?
The priority for them is Africa, especially the whole of Africa in particular. We never had any evidence that al-Shabaab tried to bomb a Western target, whether in London or any of other European capitals. All these reports that they are going to attack in London, I believe, immature until now.
Meleagrou-Hitchens, back to you. You were near the border, the Kenyan-Somalian border, and you spoke to militants who had been recruited to al-Shabab. What were they telling you, and what were the reasons that they were giving you for joining the militia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I spoke to around half a dozen, and a lot of them were foot soldiers. But I mean, and they were, I should mention also Kenyans, Kenyan Muslims. And really, there was a pretty even split. I mean, a lot of them come from slums near Nairobi and in Nairobi, called one of which is known as Majengo, the other Eastleigh, one of which is more Kenyan, Majengo, and Eastleigh is far more Somali. And these are destitute places, extreme poverty. And, you know, so half of them told me they did it purely for the money. I mean, they were Muslims, but they were not really wrapped up in any of the ideological elements of it. Another half of them did honestly tell me that they did it because they were convinced by not a very convincing, charismatic Kenyan preacher called Ahmed Iman Ali, who's currently one of the more senior guys in al-Shabab at the moment. They were convinced by him that they were not fulfilling their duty as Muslims, and the usual kind of message that Al-Qaeda can use to mobilize Muslims.
Well, I'll turn to you, Brooke. You're an expert in the psychology of militant groups. These people join these groups for ideological reasons, don't they? Or do they join them for political reasons, or is it purely a religious factor?
I would say that it's none of the above. When we start looking at, say, at Western individuals who enter into groups or become affiliated with groups and even go so far as to go abroad to train, to either engage in violent activities abroad or to bring those activities home, we find that it's much more about social issues and sometimes even social pressures quite often about a lack of opportunity, a lack of self-esteem. When we actually start looking at their understanding of ideology, we find that it's actually quite weak. They can quote some of the scriptures, some of the lines, but they don't actually understand it in full. And so it's much more about social movements and identity issues, where they feel that, let's say in the West, if they've been raised in the Western culture, they find that they're not really fitting in here, and they're trying to find where they will fit in elsewhere.
Abdul Bari Atwan, you've written, your book coming out is called The Next Generation of Al-Qaeda. Would it be fair to say that the recruits for Al-Qaeda are less ideologically driven?
I disagree completely with this interpretation, because those people actually join Al-Qaeda for ideological reason, because of their belief, because of their Islamic tendencies. So it's not purely money. It is not because of poverty. Otherwise, why should they go and sacrifice themselves? Why should they go in a suicidal attacks, as we noticed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and also in Libya, other places? So I believe it is ideological reason. We haven't any example that people, because of money, they go and blow themselves up or drive a booby-trapped car. So I think the reason is, they are recruited by Al-Qaeda. They were convinced that this is the best way to serve their cause. This is the best way to serve their creeds, which is, the Sharia law. So, and now the new generation of Al-Qaeda, especially in Somalia, they are really more ruthless, more actually stronger than the previous generation in Afghanistan and other parts of the world. So we have to be very careful about that. And we noticed that they are the only branch of Al-Qaeda which generate money. So I think there are religious motives behind that.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing, is Africa the new front for Al-Qaeda? Joining me is Abdul Bari Atwan, editor-in-chief of the London-based newspaper Qudds Al Arabi. In the studio is Brooke Rodgers. She's a senior lecturer in risk and terror at King's College London. And also joining me in the studio is Hitchens, a research fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation. Well, that's true, isn't it, Brooke Rodgers? I mean, surely to corral people and convince them to kill themselves, they have to have a belief that they have a monopoly on the truth, and that's religious truth. That's got to be central to any kind of militancy.
I would disagree, and almost all of the academic literature that actually looks at terrorism as a tactic would say that it's to fulfill political aims, political goals. And so if you're actually looking at the end goal of the rhetoric, which is to establish a caliphate, again, that's also a political goal and a political aim. So what we're doing is saying, yes, they might actually have some religious belief, but the driving force of their violent behavior is more about, it could be right time, right place. It could just be that, they come into contact with individuals who are already part of a movement or talking about a movement that actually motivates an individual who already has quite real concrete grievances or perceived grievances within their lives, and they go, that makes sense to me. They can come to hold strong religious beliefs and accurate religious beliefs sometimes, but overall it's a social movement. All of the evidence and all of the interviews that we have undertaken underscore this time and time again.
Is that something that you found, Hitchens?
Well, I think we need to sort of not look at it so sort of binarily, because when we're not just talking about guys becoming suicide bombers, we're not just talking about guys going and blowing themselves up. We're talking about a group like al-Shabab that needs foot soldiers as well. We're talking about guys who need to be fighting with AK-47s, guys that need to be guarding the camps. Not everyone there is an ideological extremist, but we should of course divide. I mean, the guys who are recruiting these guys, like Ahmed Iman Ali in Kenya, like Godan, who's one of the Al-Qaeda global jihadists in al-Shabab. These guys absolutely are ideological extremists who are mobilized by Wahhabi jihadist, Salafi jihadist ideology. There's no doubt about that. But the guys who they rope into this stuff absolutely are by no means always totally on board with the religious message. We're talking about guys who it's almost akin to joining a sort of national military. They're joining because they're guaranteed food, they're guaranteed they're promised money, which they're often not given in the end. And like I said, it was an even split. There were guys who told me that they were not at all on board with the religious stuff. They were joining because they were promised $500 a month, which is almost 4 times the average monthly wage in Kenya, and because they were promised their families were going to be taken care of. Other guys told me, yes, this was because I was convinced by a charismatic preacher that, you know, my interpretation, my practice of Islam was not, you know, on par with where it should be. And so I think we shouldn't just look at it as you know, suicide bombers and not, you know, it's not simple as that. The guys who are suicide bombers, again, yes, you're not doing that for the money. That's for sure.
Abdul Bari Atwan, does that make it a stronger organisation in that if you have a split between people who are religiously and ideologically driven and those who are simply foot soldiers who are doing it for the money?
Oh yes, definitely. I'm not generalizing here. I'm not saying that everybody Al-Qaeda organizations, especially the new generation, are there for mainly because they are extremists. But the majority of Al-Qaeda members are extremists. I remember when I researched my book, and also when I interviewed Osama bin Laden in 1996, he told me that in order to test the loyalty of the members or the new recruits of Al-Qaeda, he usually prepared them and asked them to go for a suicidal attack. If they actually hesitate, it means they are not really true believers, and usually they leave them aside. Maybe they employ them as drivers or as foot soldiers, but the majority, the hardcore of this organization, are people who believe that they are serving their Islamic cause. They are doing that in order to go to heaven. That's why this organization is extremely dangerous. And once they actually put their foot in a certain place, and so whether in Africa or in Europe or North Africa in particular, they are there to die in order to have the quickest way to paradise. This is how they believe, and it is extremely difficult to fight those people. What to do to them? To kill them? They are already willing to be killed. So they are already, looking forward to be killed in order to go to heaven.
And when we're looking, the original question was also about the West, the threat to the West from some of these groups. And when you're looking at the Westerners who go over there and join up, of which there are quite a few, best known probably Abu Mansur al-Amriki, also known as Omar Hamami, is American, who's been fighting on the front lines with al-Shabab for a while now. These guys are definitely not going for poverty reasons. These guys are going because they specifically converted to the most extreme interpretation of Islam originally. And, the zealotry of the convert really comes into play on these. And so, of course, when you're looking at the Western recruits, this is not an issue of poverty whatsoever. This is an ideological issue. And I disagree with Abdul Bari Atwan about the threat to the West. The intent is there within the al-Shabab. There's no doubt. Hamami has said it himself a number of times. They wouldn't say no to the opportunity if it arose. But their focus, like I said, and I do agree, their focus is East Africa at this point. But there's no way that if the opportunity came to some of these very hardcore Al-Qaeda guys in al-Shabab to orchestrate an attack in the West, if it came into their lap, they certainly wouldn't say no to it.
Talking about Western recruits, Brooke Rodgers, you know about the psychology of why people join these groups. I mean, what are some of the reasons why people in the West, from the United Kingdom, from the US, go to Somalia?
In the Western countries, we have been seeing what's referred to as an undeniable growing level of religiosity amongst younger generation Muslims in the UK. We've also seen this in France, and we're waiting to see this in Spain as well. And in this case, their parents have immigrated over to the UK, and they've settled, and they're raising their family around other Muslim families quite often, but around traditional British families as well, white British families. And so the children are growing up in a new society with exposure to new experiences that are not familiar to their parents. The children want to be British, they are British, and therefore they try to identify themselves as that, and they feel that they're rejected. But then they also say, well, okay, I'm going to embrace my Muslim identity instead, and they start looking around at their friends whose parents might have immigrated from another village or another area who say that they're Muslim, and they recognize that there are different practices actually, and they say, well, I'm Muslim and you're Muslim, but we're doing this quite differently. So does that mean that one of us is wrong? And then they try to find out what it actually means to be Muslim. And so they start finding people who will have discussions with them. And in the past, this was very difficult to have that. It was very difficult to have that discussion in a mosque because they were worshipping in different languages. It was very much set up to support the elders in the community. So they went elsewhere for these conversations and for this information.
When you're looking at this second generation Western issue, and we'll look at the Somali community, for example, well, we have Somali Islam and Somalia. Islam in a lot of East Africa actually doesn't have much in common with the Wahhabi Salafism that has been imported over the last, say, 40 years. They are Sufi, quietist, spiritualist Muslims often. So the ones who have come over here, and we've seen also with the Pakistani diaspora, their parents, the Islam of their parents, is it's very culturally infused as well. So all the things of arranged marriage and all this and that isn't actually in part of the pure Islam. All this other stuff comes into it that really doesn't grate with the cultural understandings of their kids. And so the kids want an Islam that tells them about their life and can explain things about their global politics to them, which the Islam of their parents can't do. So they go looking for another type of Islam that's more relevant to their everyday life.
Abdul Bari Atwan, it's Western recruits that are dissatisfied with the Islam that they're raised with.
Well, actually, I mixed with the Somali community in London, and I can tell the majority of the community, the younger generation, they are extremely westernized, and they are non-practice Muslims. They are not mosque goers. But you have the minority usually in everywhere. They are very radicalized simply because they feel they are secluded. They feel they are actually targeted racially in a way or another, and those people easily be recruited by radical organization. And we know a lot of breaches in this country and also in the Western world who are breaching a radical type of Islam. But we can say those are extremely, a minority. They are not actually the mainstream of the Somali or Muslim community in this country. But until now, as I said, we haven't seen a traces of Somali groups actually, or Somali young people are recruited in order to carry out attacks. Maybe some people were suspect and arrested, but until now, we haven't seen a single attack by a Somali younger generation.
What do you make of that, Alexander?
Yes, that's true. We haven't seen one in the West, but a young man from the area I live in Acton, about 2-3 years ago, British Somali, did go over there and blow himself up as a suicide bomber. So these are the kind of trends we cannot ignore. This is what happened with 7/7. We ignored the fact that countless numbers of British Pakistanis were going over to fight for the numerous jihadist groups that existed in Kashmir and Azad Kashmir and around there. We were ignoring the fact they were going there because we didn't expect them to come back. We thought, why would they want to come back here? And then we had 7/7. And we definitely, that's not something we want to ignore again. And we're not. We know that MI5 regularly have said, they're very concerned about this. And I would be surprised if it happened, because that would be a real failure of what have otherwise been a very, very effective intelligence organization in the last few years.
Well, in particular, we're talking about al-Shabab here, but I'll draw your attention to General Carter Ham, the head of US military operations in Africa, said that al-Shabab was sharing information with Boko Haram, with Al-Qaeda, or AQIM. They were sharing resources and training fighters together. Abdul Bari Atwan, do you think this is true?
Yeah, I believe it is true, yes. There are a lot of coordination between the al-Shabab of Somalia and the Boko Haram in Nigeria, and also the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in North Africa now, Al-Qaeda in Mali and the Sub-Saharan region. I believe Al-Qaeda is expanding, especially in North of Africa, and they are stronger now, and they, sitting on a huge arsenal of arms, which actually was available to them when the Gaddafi regime collapsed. And we know now that the south of Libya is a complete anarchy, and so Al-Qaeda now is actually getting money and by kidnapping some sort of Western people, Western tourists, and also getting arms. So I believe they are lethal here. They are really very, very strong, and we have to remember that they are very close to Europe.
These presumably aren't nationalist aspirations. What do they share? What beliefs would Boko Haram share with al-Shabab and AQIM? The desire for a global caliphate with Sharia law at its heart?
Well, actually, all of that. They want to imply or apply the Sharia law. They would like to fight the West. They would like to actually fight these regimes like the Algerian one. They call it atheist. So it is plenty of elements together. We cannot single out one actually reason. So, but the coordination between them is huge, and they believe they are fighting for the same causes. So, and helping each other, money is available, as I said, weapons. Al-Qaeda now transformed to be not only a global organization, but a lethal organization. And I wouldn't believe, with a state of anarchy spreading in North Africa in particular, I wouldn't be surprised if some people like Mohamed Marah of France, who attacked the Toulouse school just about 3 months ago, this type of infiltration of the West could be actually the routinic things in the coming few months or maybe few years. So we have to be very, very worried when Al-Qaeda is expanding in the other side of the Mediterranean.
Alexander Hitchens.
Yeah, we're also actually seeing these groups share tactics. Boko Haram have been fairly well known for attacking churches in Nigeria. And this is what we saw in Garissa about a week ago, just over a week ago, which is on the border of Somalia and Kenya, where suspected Shabab members massacred a church crowd there. And the intention is clear, as well as what we're talking about, what their intentions might be. Of course, they have international intentions, but the initial ones must be as they would refer to as the purification of Islam in their country, as well as the removal or the subjugation of non-Muslims. And one of the ways they want to initiate that is by causing sectarian problems between Christians and Muslims in these countries, which would lead to further instability. In Nigeria, we saw after a recent bombing of a church, which killed a lot of people. I can tell you, I'm not sure of the numbers. The whole roof collapsed on the congregation. Right after that, members of that congregation went out and lynched the closest Muslims they could find. And this is the kind of thing that they're going to want to see more of. They want to cause, in countries where the relations between Christians and Muslims has been very, very good historically, in general, they want to cause real problems between them.
And Brooke Rodgers, I mean, what do you make of that?
I'm agreeing with both of the comments that have been made, but I also think that we need to add a caution here, because we're seeing that Al-Qaeda and on the African continent are actually forging links with organized criminal organizations. So we're seeing links and sharing of weapons and money with drug traffickers, with counterfeiters, et cetera, and that dilutes their message. So if they are growing in strength through these partnerships, they need to be very, very careful, because Al-Qaeda's overall ability to maintain support will actually be determined by their ability to maintain cohesion between their operations and their ideological discourse.
Discussing Al-Qaeda in Africa is Brooke Rodgers, Alexander Hitchens, and Abdul Bari Atwan. Abdul Bari Atwan, that's a fair point, isn't it? We talked a little bit earlier about al-Shabab, and effectively, it has a great money-making operation in a sense, but carrying out acts that a true Muslim would consider pretty un-Islamic. Does that mean that would actually be an asset for the West in tackling them?
Yes, it could be. But the problem is, how can you tackle them? How can you fight them? You are not actually targeting a country like what happened in Gaddafi case, for example, or what happened in Saddam Hussein case. You are actually fighting a loose organization with individual people spreading everywhere, and they can cause a lot of harm. We have to remember that the people who caused the attacks or who carry out the attacks on 11th of September, they were only 19 people. So you don't need an army in order to carry out certain kind of attacks.
Just actually referring to Mali, for instance, the attacks on holy Islamic sites there by fellow Muslims. How is that viewed across the Muslim world among moderate Muslims?
Definitely they disagree with this kind of practice, but this is the problem of the Wahhabi sect of Islam. And we notice similar things took place in Saudi Arabia itself. A lot of tombs of the early Islamic leaders, for example, or Sahaba were destroyed. So I think very, very few attention, unfortunately, is paid toward these kind of practices in Mali. Few people raise their voices against it simply because it is far away, and the people in the Muslim world and the Arab world in particular are busy with the Arab Spring. They are not actually concentrated on the fringes of the Muslim world, and that's what's happening.
Actually referring to the Arab Spring, where democracy is taking a hold in Libya and in Egypt. Alexander Hitchens, what kind of effect will this have on Al-Qaeda strongholds? Is this a tool in the fight against Al-Qaeda, this democratization of this region, or is it something that will actually foster more resentment and further militancy?
I think it's very early. It really depends. I mean, even the word democratization, if we're looking at what's happening in Egypt right now, is is probably a bit of as a compliment. I mean, it really depends how things go. Instability anywhere, loss of political control by the state is the place where Al-Qaeda will thrive. So it really depends on how things go. I mean, of course, it affected the Al-Qaeda narrative that only violence can remove the dictators, because obviously that's not what happened. They were able to do it largely non-violently, especially in Egypt. We'll see. I mean, I think it's too early to tell, but I'd say most Egyptians, absolutely, vast majority, and even the Salaf, even the Wahhabi-inspired ones, who generally would go nowhere near elections, are taking part in elections. So, I think we can hope.
And Brooke Rodgers, clearly tackling poverty in these regions is more effective, isn't it? And that will be a disincentive for the disenfranchised to join Al-Qaeda.
I do believe that poverty does play a role. So many studies have come out that set out to explore the role of poverty in violent radicalization, and the findings again and again and again find very little support for the role of poverty, and interventions that are only targeted at addressing issues of poverty and not addressing wider social issues are almost set up to fail, because if you start raising the expectations of the individuals you're engaging with, and let's say through education and through additional opportunities, if that program is then removed, or if they are educated to a level where they have or desire additional options, and they find that they still don't have options within the country that they're living, then you still find a new opportunity for radicalization.
Abdul Bari Atwan, Jonathan Evans, the head of British MI5, he said the Arab Spring countries present a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. Do you believe that's true?
Actually, we cannot generalize here. Definitely, there are countries in the Middle East witnessed some sort of Arab Spring protest, and Western intervention actually helped Al-Qaeda, like the case of Libya, simply because of the NATO intervention created a failed state in a way or another. And even the election in Libya, we cannot say it is heading toward a stable state. Once you have a failed state, once you have instability, this is the best environment for Al-Qaeda, like what happened in south of Libya and other parts of Libya, actually. The same thing still in Egypt, since the Arab Spring started. Sinai actually is really very, very a dangerous place. Some of organizations affiliated to Al-Qaeda ideology, actually, they are setting bases in Sinai, and the same thing could happen in other parts of the Middle East. So it is premature to tell, but definitely the failure of the Arab Spring to produce stable states, stable democratic states in the Middle East, this will be a God gift to Al-Qaeda. So, but if they succeeded, if you have investment there, if you have the quality of life improved, if you created jobs for people, this actually will limit the aspiration of Al-Qaeda, limit the presence of Al-Qaeda in these Arab Spring countries.
Alexander Hitchens, do you agree that that North Africa and parts of Africa are the new safe havens for Al-Qaeda, and that's from where they can launch attacks on the West? And if so, what can the West do about it?
I absolutely think that it will be a source of big problems for us in the future. And I think, actually, when we look at AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia, who are doing fairly well, actually, who have done a fairly good job of dealing with al-Shabab and Al-Qaeda presence in Somalia. So what we've seen is actually an African solution to an African problem. There is not much patience for these guys in Africa, for jihadists in Africa. And the governments, the problems which the governments have themselves, and corruption, etc., is going to cripple them in some ways. But, I think we can rely on a lot of African forces to deal with this problem, and hopefully we won't have to be too much involved on the surface of it.
Okay, we'll leave it there. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me here at the Voice of Russia. That's Abdul Bari Atwan, editor-in-chief of the London-based newspaper Al-Quds Al Arabi, Brooke Rodgers, senior lecturer in risk and terror at King's College London, and Alexander Hitchens, research fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation. Thanks very much for joining me.